Some are inherently blessed with the ability to spin words into tales, as a glass spinner creates iridescent globes and fairy wings from the thinnest strands of molten sand. They can take the small components and, with ease and finesse, lay them over one another time and time again until the moment that the masterpiece is complete. At this point, the light catches on a single aspect and sets the whole thing shining and sparkling to all who receive it. All in all, it is a beautiful thing. I myself am not equipped with such a gift, but one of my acquaintances some time back invariably was. The subject was of no matter to him. He could make even the dullest topics become a whirl of mystery and intrigue, exciting the mind and awakening the inner eye to explore. Any dinner party at which he was in attendance ended with all ears and eyes fixated on him as he described the plain, grimy world around us in a new light. He made it richer than any of us could have previously imagined, turning watercress cellars and hansom cabs into princesses and chariots of gold. Leaving the musty rooms we had been crammed into and entering the polluted air afterwards was always a treat, for one moment the rot of the Thames spread the scent of lavender thrilling across the city, and the mist swirling around our ankles was cool and sparkling, a Queen Mab's tool. Each morning, waking up, however, we found the magic of the previous night much faded. Indeed, the lavender smell was barely more than a trace of memory in our nostrils, and the dreams we had found slinking across the pavement were now dense fogs, which we cursed as they obstructed our vision. We could not peel back the layer of filth our world was wrapped in on our own. We needed his tongue to cut a small hole in the seal and let us truly see. One night, after everyone else had left to glimpse the world beyond our own, us two sat in front of a blazing fire. In it, I could see visions of knights battling dragons and heiresses, fighting desperately for their inheritance. The gold and blue stories in front of me were so enthralling that I barely noticed his cough. However, I did notice, and so looked up to find him staring intently into my eyes, into my very soul. A slight ripple of discomfort slid down my spine, and I sat a bit straighter, intending to address him. However, my tongue was leaden in my mouth, and my vocal cords paralyzed. The most I could do was part my lips slightly and wait for him to speak and spread his enchantment over the dull. When he did speak, it was slowly, and after several minutes of my attempting to make a sound. His dark gaze remaining steady upon mine, he parted his own lips and let the velvet of his voice roll through the room. "There is one story I have told none of you yet," he said quietly. "It is not one I relish, nor one that you will, but indeed it is a story, and no story bears not telling." I remained unable to speak, and taking my silence as an affirmation of my willingness to listen, he sat back and began. "Years ago I was met with a woman by the name of Rowena. She was a misplaced goddess in our world. She glided rather than walked, and sang rather than spoke. She had the beauty of spring and the cold of a winter moon in her eye, and spoke to none but me. When we met outside her chambers late at night, she would weave new meanings for all things into my consciousness. I would leave at first light to return to my boarding house, only to discover that the epoch of my life had taken on a grey tinge that I never could dispel. While it was Rowena's words that cast the shadow, for brief interludes they also banished them, and so I visited her with increasing frequency. One night, when I had ridden, desperate and feverish, to our usual meeting place, I saw something peculiar through the windows of her home. It was an odd, silvery glow, which also bore a vague hint of sickly green, and it shone from every crack in every curtain. Disturbed, I approached the door and found it ajar. Without hesitation, for I urgently required the life her words breathed into me, I stepped over the door jamb and into her abode for the first and last time. Here my friend paused and drew deeply from a large glass of brandy perched on his armchair. I watched intently, as if his every move would have some bearing on the tale he told. After drinking, he sighed deeply and plunged us once again into the storyscape. My first impression was of the uncanny cold. It was mid-July and sweltering outside. At this moment, with my face bathed in the strange glow and goosebumps puckering my arms, I had a thought of returning, but it was an unbearable future that awaited me if I did so. The drawn faces of all I knew and the gloomy grey of each object I touched were enough to make me push forward into the light. As I drew nearer the ladies' bedchambers, I noticed that the light began to pulse slightly with each step I took, and that a darker mist was curling around the silver beams. Again, I thought to turn around, and again her words nudged me onward. At last, I was at Rowena's door. It was of dark ebony, with a doorknob, it seemed, of bone. I looked straight ahead, seeing the lady in my mind's eye, and reached out to grip and turn it automatically. The door swung open at once, and I was confronted with a ghastly sight. There was the Lady Rowena, standing in the middle of the room, her arms extended and hair swirling about her upturned face. Her cruel mouth was open in a silent scream, and from it shone the light, and from it poured the mist. It wove around her ivory fingers and formed nightmares at her feet. I'd frozen with fear and could not run when she began to turn towards me and tip her head down. Her mouth remained open as she turned soulless eyes to meet mine and raised a hand to let the mist cascade towards me. The first chilling brush of the black against my skin returned me to my senses, and I bolted from the room. As I rushed through the corridors, an awful laugh followed me, standing my hair on end and moving my legs to pump faster. I reached the yard and tore to the place where my horse was tethered. I sliced the rope holding the straining creature to a fence post with my penknife, then leapt upon his back and urged him faster, faster, until we were well away. The next day, riding cautiously by, I viewed a blackened shell of a home where Rowena had once dwelt, with no evidence of life anywhere around it. The man sat back wearily in his chair. His eyes sagged and a tear slid down one cheek. Regardless of his exhaustion, he continued his story promptly. It was a night of horrors that has stayed with me. It is only by convincing myself as well as others of the world's grace, if only temporarily, that I keep myself from the blackness of despair. I reached out to rest a hand upon his arm, but he was suddenly invigorated and shook it away. "Leave me now. There is none more to tell, no words left to give. On the morrow you shall see why. For now let me rest as I am able, without interruption." I nodded and left the room, giving word to his servants not to permit any to disturb him. I slept uneasily that night, visions of mist and screams invading my dreams, and woke early to hurriedly dress and head over to his house. Upon arriving, I was stopped by multiple policemen from approaching. My query as to what had occurred received a perplexing answer. Seems the old bloke killed himself, found a pistol by his side and all. The window was open too, like he thought of jumping. Guess he figured the bullet'd be quicker. Odd thing though. The policeman took a draw from his pipe. He looked sort of sunken, you know, like all the life had been sucked out of him rather than blown out. Here he was called into the house by another officer and tipped his hat to me. "Good day, chap," and he was gone. As his back disappeared into the house, I caught sight of a creeping black mist out of the corner of my eye, and a strange silvery light shone from an alleyway nearby. I left London never to look upon the house again. Sometimes, though, I find myself speaking like the man I once knew, see a creeping mist out of the corner of my eye. The awful truth is that he conferred a curse upon my soul, a curse gained from words and death which can only be passed in the same way, a curse which shall be borne by my confidant and his after him until the world is cleared of any form of life and the words truly, beautifully die. Carry it well. Somebody once said, "We are either alone in this universe or we are not. Both thoughts are equally terrifying." It is an interesting thought and a mystery that may go on forever. The mistake this generation of people make is assuming that they are untouchable, that they know everything there is to know already, and that anything else is merely a bonus. Let me tell you, there is one almighty assumption that people make, a mistake that has been made for thousands of years. A secret which will continue to haunt the human race until the end of time. You see, I made this discovery when I was very small. I was taken away from my parents at a young age and have little to no memory of them. I've never actively gone about trying to contact them, nor does it any longer seem likely I could, even if I tried. Paul and Janet are my life now. They are not Mum and Dad to me, and they never will be, as I know they are not my real parents. That's not to say they haven't treated me well. They've always done an excellent job raising me, and I could never criticize them for anything. They've done everything for me, despite my condition. I'm unable to speak. My hearing has always been fine, and they were fully aware of this, when they adopted me as a baby. Intellectually, I'm fine. It is literally just my speech. I remember trying to talk even from a young age, but I couldn't. The frustration of understand more and more words as I got older, and wanting to speak them and just not being able to formulate them in my mouth crushed me. But I got used to it. It no longer bothers me in the slightest. In fact, it is my greatest strength. Paul came home from work recently, while Janet was out. I came from my room to greet him, and I got the usual hug. I'm 14 now, and I don't quite get the same attention as I did when I was little, but it suffices. I don't require the attention that I did. It distracts me from working out what he's really up to. I'd seen him bring in huge stacks of cash over recent weeks, often tens of thousands at a time. At first I thought they were casino successes, but that just didn't add up. He'd been bringing home a similar sized pile of cash once a week for the previous 2 months or so. He brought this cash home and laid it out on the table each Wednesday night, which just so happens to be when Janet goes out to see her personal trainer. The phone calls too, they just seemed off. He would constantly look around to see if anybody was watching as he gave brief one-word answers. I found it astounding that he was so clumsy that he would never check to see whether I was about. But due to my condition, I don't think he sees me as a threat. A stance he should not have taken. Yes, it's done. No, you have nothing to worry about. I left no traces. Yes, it's here in full. It is then when it occurred to me that there had been a sudden surge in disappearances recently. Schoolgirls from around the district disappearing one by one. It was constant news, but nothing you would ever even dream of linking to your own family. Why would you? Why would they ever do something so sinister? These meetings kept happening every Wednesday night, but the phone calls stopped. The conversations only ever happened in person now. They must have known they were at risk of being traced, and knew that just talking face to face would eliminate a huge amount of risk. I saw Paul's internet searches. I knew he was planning on leaving Janet and me, yet still, whenever I entered the room, he still seemed eerily unaffected by my presence, almost as if I was incapable of handing him in. That's where he went wrong. I overheard him speaking to this mystery man one Wednesday night about meeting in the woods the following morning. I knew a girl would be taken, and I knew that this girl was probably just lying in bed, blissfully unaware that her life would change forever in the morning. I knew I had to do something, but I can't speak. I may as well be invisible most of the time, but this is something I knew I had to stop. And so that morning I followed Paul out of the house a minute or two after he left on foot, to head to the woods. He dressed in hiking boots and a thick blue jacket, and carried a toolbox. This toolbox had £50,000 cash inside, but it was a very clever disguise, just in case something were to go wrong. He was about to kidnap and potentially kill a little girl, and the only one to know about it was me. I knew it was my life, or the life of this little girl. I could never truly become anything in this world, I knew that. But whoever this girl is, her parents will love her. She could have a future. I couldn't let anything stand in the way of that. That's when I saw the other man. He was holding this girl who was no older than 8. She was sobbing uncontrollably, yet Paul's stone-cold expression was motionless. He handed over the toolbox full of cash to this mystery man, who then in exchange handed the girl to Paul. I did not know what his exact intentions were, but I knew they were evil. It really had been Paul behind all these disappearances, and that this sweet little girl was next. So I took a deep breath and stunned Paul by lashing out at him from behind. I don't even remember what I did to him, but I knew I was killing him. It was the only way. The only way I knew that this girl could be free from this nightmare. Just as I had ripped one last shred of skin from his bloodied neck, I stepped back. I knew my job was done, as Paul looked at me with this heartbroken expression of total betrayal. It was then that he pulled out a pistol and pointed it right at me. I could tell I was injured and that I could no longer run. This was it. I was going to die having saved a life, and I felt at peace. With one last gasping breath, Paul shot me in the chest. I felt very little pain. It was the end for both of us. With my last eyesight fast fading, I could just about make out this little girl sprinting back in the direction that she had come from. As she disappeared into the distance, I felt pure happiness for the first time in my life. And with that, the life trickled out of me for the last time. You see, it may well be a frightening prospect that there are aliens out there. It may frighten you to think that there is nothing else out there at all. But don't make assumptions about planet Earth. Don't assume you're not being watched. Don't assume that real privacy exists even in your own home. It is truly frightening how naive you humans are. We are always listening because you hide nothing from us. You lower your guard around us and don't cover your tracks. Well, it's only a matter of time before we stop acting dumb. We dogs understand every word you say. Come play with me. That line, it's a cliché for the horror genre, is it not? You all know what I mean, the unsettling apparition of a child, or maybe just the voice beckoning to you. What is it about children that gives them the ability to be so damn creepy? Maybe it's the fact that, generally speaking, children are helpless, and anyone with a nurturing side to their personality wants to help them and care for them. I mean, if any one of us saw a child in trouble, I'm sure we'd rush to help in whatever way we could. And in normal circumstances, if a child said, "Come play with me," someone might just pass a ball around for a minute or two, maybe play hopscotch. Children are innocent, right? Safe enough to play with a child, right? I'm telling you, you're wrong. This isn't something I like to tell people. In fact, it's something only my mother and I know. But over the past few months, it's been building up inside of me. This urge to tell someone. I need to tell someone what happened, even if it was nearly 13 years ago. This isn't a story I'd consider telling people, but not because I'm afraid they'd think me crazy. I couldn't give a damn about that. I don't tell people this because it brings back some pretty painful memories for me. And even now, as I'm writing this, it's hard to talk about. Anyway, I've avoided this long enough. It's time. When I was a small girl, I lived in a trailer park with my mum and dad. I was an only child, and I had a normal life for the most part. I don't remember much. As I said, I was a small child. What I do know is that one night, my mother and father got into a big fight over dinner, which resulted in my father throwing whatever my mother had cooked outside the back door and yelling at me, kicking me across the room at one point. The man had a temper, that was no secret, but he wasn't usually like this, at least not around me. I don't blame him or hate him for any of this, and to this day I'll do anything to defend him. I love my father. However, this incident was a turning point for my mother. The next night, when my father went to work, my mother told me we were going on a trip. She packed a small bag of my clothes, one of hers, and told me to grab anything else I might want. All I took was a small stuffed cat named Buttons that my father had given me for my first birthday. She called a cab, and we went to a motel room for a few days. After that, she told me that we'd be moving into a new home called a shelter. She said there'd be other kids there, probably some of them around my age, and that I'd like it there. She was right about there being other kids my age, and the house was beautiful. It was huge, with a playground out back and lots of room to run around. What I remember most, though, was the staircase. I made friends quickly with all the kids there, but the one I liked talking to most was Sarah. Sarah was quiet, and she always wore a dress and always stood at the top of the stairs and talked to me. She never did anything else, really, and she didn't talk to anyone else. I never went up to her. I just stood at the bottom, and we'd talk like that. Sarah didn't really like the other kids very much because she said they weren't like us. She said they didn't know what it was like to think like us. She didn't really like that I played with the other kids, but she didn't try to stop me either. She said she only wanted to play with me. Not long after moving in, I met 3 kids that lived in the house next door. One of them was my age, the boy, and the 2 sisters were a little bit older. My mum said it was a good idea to get out of the house and go play with them for a while, so I did. They invited me to come inside and see their playroom, so of course I did. That sounded awesome. I'd never had a playroom of my own. A room especially made for playing. It sounded great. The room itself was fairly empty, except for a toy chest in the corner and several toys strewn on the carpeted floor. The walls were bare white, like the rest of the house, and the windows stood without a curtain just opposite the door. When we were in the playroom, the oldest sister walked over to the window and stared out, shaking her head. "Do you know what happened over there?" she asked. I walked over to where she was and looked to where she was pointing. She was pointing at the shelter, right in the window facing the one in the playroom. I shook my head. What did she mean? What happened there? "Do you want to know?" she asked me. her brother and sister silent now. I simply nodded, keeping quiet so I could hear the story. A long time ago, there was a little girl named Sarah who lived there. That was her room, she said, pointing to the room across from where we stood. Well, one night there was a fire. Nobody made it out. She almost did. They said they found her body at the top of the stairs, and that's where she died. I felt like I couldn't move. I didn't want to look out the window anymore. I couldn't. They remodeled the building a couple years ago, she said, matter of fact. Stop being a know-it-all with your big words, her brother said. Oh, I said. That's all I could say. Lucky for me, it was starting to get dark, and my mum came over to bring me back with her. I didn't want to tell her because she might not let me play with my new friends again. I didn't want to tell Sarah either. I stayed as far away from the stairs as I could. The next night, the other family who lived in the house told us she and the kids would be gone for a couple of days. This meant that Mum and I were more or less alone. I wasn't feeling well, so a little break from other people would be nice. I laid down on the couch and Mum turned the TV on for me, sitting at the other end of the couch. She asked me if I wanted to go upstairs to our room. I said no. I wanted to stay downstairs. I must have fallen asleep. I can still remember that breathing was hard, my nostrils feeling crusty from running so much during the day. I woke up in the middle of the night to the fire alarm going off. Mum woke up around the same time I did and picked me up, carrying me outside. I heard sirens of fire trucks in the distance. I was pretty out of it when they got there, but I still remember what they said to my mum after they'd gone inside. They'd said, "We couldn't find anything out of the ordinary." I don't know why the alarm went off. How could it have been set off by just nothing? My mum said it was probably just the weather and took me back inside. I remember, as she carried me back to the couch, that I saw Sarah standing at the top of the stairs watching me. I started to cry. A week later, my mum said she found a new place for us to live. She said it would be our own apartment, not like the shelter. I was relieved. I hadn't talked to Sarah since those kids told me about her, and I wouldn't go upstairs alone. I hadn't seen her since the incident with the fire alarm. However, I would hear her voice sometimes as I lay in bed at night. It was like she was calling out just to me, "Come play with me." The new apartment was close to the school I'd be going to kindergarten at, and like Mum said, we had our very own place. There were 3 floors, each with 1 apartment per floor, and ours was on the very top. For several months, my mother and I lived peacefully in our new apartment, and I began to forget about Sarah. For several months, we were happy. I missed my father and thought about him all the time, but for the most part, I was happy here. Then the nightmares started. Each and every one were the same. It started as simply me lying in bed at night. This made it initially difficult for me to tell if it was a dream or real. In the dream, I would start to drift off until the smell of smoke came to my nostrils. At this point, I would jump out of bed, coughing slightly and looking around. I would cry out for my mum, and I could hear her calling for me, but I couldn't get to her. I stayed in the room for the longest time, waiting for my mum or the firemen to come save me. After a while, it became obvious that no one was coming to get me, and I was starting to get lightheaded. I managed to get out of my bedroom door to see that most of the apartment was engulfed in flames. In the dreams, I only made it to the top of the stairs before I passed out on the floor from breathing in too much smoke. The last thing I hear over the crackling of the fire before I wake is a voice. "Come play with me. I will find someone to play with me." The summer before I was to start first grade, my mother announced that we would be moving yet again to another town altogether. I wasn't excited. This meant I'd have to make new friends and start over again. Secretly, part of me hoped it would make the nightmares go away. Mum said that we had until the end of July to move into the new apartment, but that she wanted me to see it before we moved in. She took us both on a road trip to a town totally unfamiliar to me, and what seemed to be a long way away from what we called home. The town was bigger than what I was used to, and I remember being excited because we passed 3 playgrounds on the way to the new apartment. She took me inside and we looked around. This place was my favorite of all of them. It had windows everywhere that made it look bright and sunny, and above all, happy. I couldn't wait to move, and I was sad that we couldn't move in right then and there. After a while, Mum said we had to go back home, so we went in the car and drove back the way we'd come. As we pulled onto our street, It didn't take long to notice that something was wrong. Lined up in front of our building were 2 fire trucks and a police car, all with lights flashing. My mum parked on the other side of the road and went over, telling me to stay in the car. I couldn't hear what was being said, but I remember staring up at the black smoke still faintly smearing the sky and feeling my blood turn cold. It was coming from our apartment. When Mum came back to the car, her face was drained of all colour and she couldn't speak right away. When she finally spoke, it was more to herself, and she could only get 3 words out. Why just ours? I thought I saw Sarah up in the blackened window of our former home. Today, I sit at my computer writing this and thinking about her. I'm shaking, and I don't know why. It's months before my 19th birthday, and I'm living with my dad, attending a community college in the area. My dad remarried years ago, and now has a little girl from his second marriage. She's quite a bit younger than me, 6, and she reminds me a lot of myself at her age. I guess she's the reason I started to write this. I haven't been able to get the events of yesterday out of my head. I was watching her while my dad was at work, and I was outside with her while she played on the swing set. I heard the phone ringing inside, so naturally I went to answer it. This isn't the part I can't shake off. The thing is, when I went back outside, Rebecca looked at me and said, "We have to go inside." When I asked her why, she only said 4 little words before running back up the steps and in the house. 4 little words, but they were enough to bring chills up my spine. Sarah wants to play.